peace. This is the Hebrew word shalom. It occurs 236 times in the Old Testament, and it's usually translated peace, but it's also rendered in other ways, such as health, welfare, and prosperity. Its meaning embraces ideas of wholeness and safety as well as peace. So it has a much more expansive range of meanings than the word peace in English, although peace in English, of course, also has many uses. The Greek word that's used in the New Testament for peace is eirene, and it appears 92 times in the New Testament. It's one of its most common uses is in greetings and salutations, particularly in the epistles. And it's very clear in the New Testament that peace is a key Christian principle. And one of the main focus of this is the peace that is available in Christ. So what we're going to talk about today is the biblical perspective, in particular the New Testament perspective, on war, peace, non-resistance, and separation from the state. These themes are all intertwined. But before we do that, I want to just say something about the biblical view of time. So yesterday, we looked at this profound statement of God's existence in time, found in Revelation 1 and verse 8. I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is now, who was in the past, and who is to come, the Almighty. It's as if the text is saying that God fills time. God is eternal, as we saw yesterday. There also is in the Bible as a whole a very clear sense that time is unidirectional. It starts with the beginning. So there you see the Greek word arche, which is beginning, and it flows towards a goal. So this is the Greek word telos, which is used in the New Testament. Both these words are found in the Bible. And it's often translated as end, but end in the sense of the end justifies the means, right? So it's actually often better translated as goal, right? And so there's a passage in the book of Romans where Paul says that Christ is the goal at which the law or the Torah aims, right? So when you translate it as end, it doesn't quite give the right meaning. So I want to stress this because the arrow of time has a goal. It's moving in a particular direction, and that goal is peace. That goal is the millennium. That goal is God being all in all, as we read in 1 Corinthians. However, there will be some dislocations and tumults along the way. And the book of Revelation, chapter 16, of course, presents us with the battle of Armageddon. I'm not exceptionally old, but I'm not exceptionally young. I've lived several decades. I can't think of another time in the history of the earth when the nations have been more troubled than they are now. I lived through much of the Cold War and the specter of a nuclear exchange. And I see this and hear this from the students I teach in the university, that they are really very anxious. They don't see any certainty in the future. They're thinking about the environment, but they're also thinking about all the political conflicts and the military conflicts. We have a larger perspective, which is that history goes towards this peace that the Bible talks about, both the Old and the New Testaments. Now, if we look at Christian history, we can see that a different view of time develops, and this comes partly, or even largely, through the influence of Platonism and other Greek forms of philosophy. So in the Bible, we have this very clear sense that there's a beginning, right in the first chapter of the Bible, the book of Genesis. Of course, we have the creation, so we have a beginning. History is moving towards the millennium, and then ultimately God being all in all. God's sovereignty will be complete. So there is a singular notion of salvation, time, or history. We're on this trajectory here, whereas Augustine and other early church theologians started to develop this idea that we have souls, and they sort of hop off this arrow of time into a realm of timelessness. And this is heavily influenced by Platonism. So this is why I'm calling it a dualist notion of salvation time. You still have history in the material world, but then the saints sort of hop off that line. Well, this is not the biblical perspective. This is the biblical perspective here. And this relates to our theme of peace. Now, you might say, well, that's kind of intuitive that time moves in an arrow. Well, in fact, this is not the case in all cultures. So, for example, in Hinduism, we have this idea of time being a cycle. And this is true in terms of individuals and the reincarnation of birth and rebirth, but also in terms of the view of the cosmos. So the cosmos has this kind of cycle that it goes through. It's born, and then it decays, and then it is essentially destroyed in a conflagration. And that's what this statue of Shiva, the Hindu god, is pointing to. So if we compare Western, which is largely biblical views of time, we see that in terms of the human, which I've called the microcosm, we have resurrection, we have one life. There's a linear view of time, also with the universe and reality as a whole, whereas in Eastern traditions, we have this cyclical view. Yes, there are cycles in the Bible. We find this in the book of Ecclesiastes, but these are seasons, right? Day to day, those kind of cycles, and they are subordinated under this arrow of time. So this is a really interesting comparison because it shows us how a worldview can even affect one's view of time, right? When we compare the Western, which is based on the biblical view of time, with many Eastern views of time. Now, I mentioned yesterday the Left Behind series and how it promotes this idea that there's going to be a rapture, that the saints are going to be lifted off the earth and go into heaven, and some people who are not Christians are going to be left behind. So that's the meaning behind that phrase. And there have been many iterations of it. This is one movie version of that series of novels. And this theology or teaching of the end, a teaching of time, is very common in the evangelical community in particular. Not all evangelicals hold this view, but it is a very common view. Where does this idea come from? Well, it comes in part from an interpretation of 2 Peter 3. So in 2 Peter 3, verses 8 and 9, we read, "But do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day." So whatever this is saying, it's telling us that God's experience of time is different than ours. It's obviously, he is infinite in terms of power and in terms of eternity. "The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done in it will be," now if you have a King James or many other English translations, the text then says will be burned up. Whereas the ESV and some other modern translations based on a different a reading in the Greek have the word found. And this seems to be in the sense of exposed to judgment. So that puts a different meaning on this text. And then, of course, there is the issue of whether we take this literally or not. So For those in the evangelical community who take this literally, they see this as speaking to the destruction of the earth and maybe even the universe, and then it's replaced with something else. This is clearly not the biblical view, but that's the source of it. Is not the text itself, but an interpretation of that text. Now, this language of the heavens is probably allegorical. It's probably referring to the political heavens. It's probably referring to the political systems of the nations. And we don't have time to go into this, but there is some biblical evidence for that. Peter goes on to say, since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hasting the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. But according to his new promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Even if there is a literal element to this text, Peter has also referred to the flood of Noah. And of course, that was not the destruction of the globe. That involves some dislocations on the surface of the globe and affected humanity. It affected the systems of things as they existed, but then there was a renewal. So if we follow that analogy, then clearly we would not conclude that this text is talking about the destruction of the earth. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background on the biblical view of time, and it relates to what we're going to talk about for the rest of our presentation, which is that time is moving towards perfect peace, and this will be when the Prince of Peace returns. I want to take you to Isaiah chapter 2. This is a very important passage in the Bible, and give you some sense of the impact of this passage even in the secular world. So Isaiah 2, we'll start at verse 1. The word that Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. So, roughly 7 centuries before the time of Christ, we have this vision of world peace, and scholars and others, including people who are not Christian, often point to this passage as the earliest expression of this idea of universal peace. Micah 4 and 3 has essentially the same language, and Joel has it the other way around, when you're turning agricultural implements into instruments of war for a time of war. So this idea has permeated various different cultures around the world, including the former Soviet Union. So this is a statue that the Soviet Union donated to the United Nations. It's in New York City. And it shows a very muscular man beating a sword into a plow. And then nearby there is this inscription, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So such is the power of this vision that even an officially atheist society like the former Soviet Union saw the vision and presented this statue, and then there is this other inscription nearby. This is an interesting model of a plowshare, and it's made out of a decommissioned nuclear weapon. and it was donated to the International Atomic Agency by the Republic of South Africa. So again, it's picking up on this biblical language. This is a university in North Carolina. It's a bell tower, which also has the words from Isaiah 2, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares. This is a monument in Jerusalem, in Israel. So this is what the text is about, right? It's pointing to Zion. So this is near Mount Zion in Jerusalem, in modern Israel, and it shows some metal from military hardware that has been created into a kind of a plow-like image, and there is an inscription that refers to that passage. This is also in Jerusalem. This is a stained glass window installation at the National Library of Israel, and it has the text, "Come, let us go up to the house of the Lord." It has the text from Isaiah 2, and on this side, it has bullets that are being transformed into shovels. So slight adjustment, but a very similar metaphor. So this language in Isaiah 2, and obviously we link it with such thoughts as praying for the peace of Jerusalem. See now how the city of Jerusalem and even many secular people recognize just how important it is to world peace. And it's just remarkable that we see this language so many centuries ago. And then, of course, there's also the dove symbol, which comes from the story of Noah's flood, which is used as a symbol of peace. This is a Picasso drawing of the dove, and this is a UN flag. And here we have another United Nations symbol showing the dove, and often the dove has the olive branch as well. The environmental organization Greenpeace also uses the dove and the rainbow from Noah's flood as a symbol for their environmental action, etc. So these are images that come from the Bible, and they're picked up by people who are largely secular. They recognize the power of them. For those of us who are believers in the Bible, this imagery has even more power to us. All right, just a few thoughts on Christianity, the history of Christianity and pacifism. It's a matter of historical record that many of the earliest post-New Testament Christians refused to serve in the military. This was the position of Tertullian and Origen, for example. Serving as a soldier was seen as incompatible with the gospel in at least two ways. War is violence, and militaries are an arm of the state. However, the thinking changed when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. The state then was Christian, or nominally so, and at least this was the view of many of the church leaders of the time, and this led to a change in thinking, and there is a shift, in a sense, back to more sort of Old Testament thinking. Now, one of the big differences between the New Testament and the Old Testament is the Old Testament, particularly the Mosaic Law, is a law for religious purposes, but it's also a law for a nation with a territory, right, in Israel. And the New Testament doesn't have that. Christianity is not a nation with a territory. And so in Old Testament times, there was open revelation from God, and there were commands from God to engage in military conflict. In the New Testament, we don't have that because Christians are not aligned with the state, right? That's the New Testament ideal. That is the biblical ideal. That has not been followed, of course, by the majority of Christians, because the thought is once the state becomes Christian, then that separation doesn't exist anymore, and we come back into kind of an Old Testament scenario. But this is a turn against the original character of the New Testament, which advocated separation from the state. However, in the early modern period, there were some groups in what is called the Radical Reformation. The Radical Reformation, so this included Mennonites, the Polish Brethren. Polish Brethren had views that are very similar to the Christadelphians. They believed in believer's baptism, for example. They did not believe in the Trinity, did not believe in the immortality of the soul. They took stands against war and violence, and this is true of some Mennonites and the Amish to this day. So to use modern expressions, they adopted pacifism and non-resistance. Now, as I think almost everyone in this room, if not everyone, knows, pacifism or non-resistance, separation from the state, and non-participation in war, our conscientious objection to war, is a defining part of the emergence of our community. So this was true even before our community had a name. In 1865, near the end of the U.S. Civil War, of course, John Thomas and some other brethren in our community went to register for conscientious objection and were told, you can do that, but you have to have a name. And so they came up with Brethren in Christ, which comes from Colossians 1, verse 2. The authorities said, we need a single word, right? And so that's where we get Christadelphian, which is a rough Greek equivalent. So our name is associated with our stance on war, non-resistance, and separation from the state. This stance, of course, is only possible in a community as small as ours. So these are the three related concepts. Now, I'm using the term pacifism, and I recognize that in our community, we don't always use that term. And so there's a thought that technically we're not pacifists. I'll say something about that in a few moments, but since pacifism literally means peacemaking, I believe that we can take this as a description of our position with various qualifications: non-resistance and separation from the state. Some of you may have encountered this statement from Bertrand Russell. So Bertrand Russell was an objector to military service in World War I, and he was interned and actually met some Christadelphians in these camps, and so got to know a little bit about our beliefs. And this is what he said: Christianity was, in its earliest days, entirely unpolitical. The best representatives of the primitive tradition in our time are the Christadelphians, who believe the end of the world to be imminent and refuse to have any part or lot in secular affairs. As the number of Christians increased and the church grew more powerful, it was inevitable that a desire to influence the state should grow up. So he's encapsulating what I've already said, that there's a shift once the church becomes the state. This idea of separation is gone, and with it, the idea of non-participation in military service. Here's another scholar who was writing in 1945 at the end of World War II. If we are to obey in detail the injunctions that were given to the first Christians, we must put ourselves in the same position as the first Christians and regard ourselves as a small band of believers living in a world that as a whole has not accepted Christ, following the path of separation and taking no responsibility for the affairs of this world. Our pacifism, then, will be merely incidental to a much higher renunciation of privileges and responsibilities. This is the line actually followed by some of the smaller Christian sects, such as the Christadelphians and the Plymouth Brethren, and in a rather different form by religious communities like the Hutterian Brothers, the Hutterites. One cannot but respect their sincerity and consistency. Personally, I feel little doubt that their attitude is much closer to the attitude of the earliest Christians than that of the larger religious communities, bodies. But there is another side to it, so here's his criticism: and the austerity with which they leave the rest of the world to its fate will repel some of us more than their undoubted virtues will attract. So it's interesting, there's this honesty about what the earliest Christians believed, and this separation from warfare and the state. Okay, let's just come back just for a minute or two to this definition, two definitions of pacifism. Peter Brock, who made a career studying pacifism, particularly amongst the descendants of the Radical Reformation, the Mennonite community, for example, 1972, in his book Pacifism in Europe to 1914, identified 6 categories of pacifism: vocational, soteriological, eschatological, separational, integrational, and goal-directed. So what is vocational? This is adopted by certain priests and certain religions, or saying that one's artistic vocation, etc., takes precedence over fighting in war. Soteriological, and this just means salvation-oriented, an objection to shedding human blood because it leads to ritual impurity and thus to the loss of personal salvation, at least until some form of purification is undergone. Eschatological is a kind of non-violent in-term ethic. In practice, like non-eschatological forms of pacifism, so it's the same so long as there is no eschatological event. So what is this? Eschatology refers to the time of the end. So the idea here is that eschatological pacifists are pacifists unless they're called on by God to fight. So many would argue that that is the view, or at least a major part of the view of the Christadelphian community. Separational is representing the typical position of the sectarian pacifists and is best exemplified in the non-resistance doctrines held successively by Czech Brethren, Anabaptists, Swiss, German, Dutch, and Polish, and Mennonites. And there's an element of that, I think, in our view as well. Integrational, using the peace ethic as an impulse in reformist movements, active in the political sphere, so that's different from our perspective. And then goal-directed is the sixth, closely linked with the integrational type. It posits as a moral principle the consistent employment of nonviolent techniques to achieve desired political or social goals on the grounds that, at least in the long run, these techniques are practically more effective than or more ethically superior to violence. We can see that some of these elements apply to our view, but not all of them. So, in other words, pacifism means different things to different people, but I think we can embrace this term with certain qualifications. As I said, the word means peacemaker, and that is something that we are commanded to be in our daily lives. Whatever happens at the return of Christ, even if we are in-term pacifists, as Peter Brock terms it, we are pacifists now. And, of course, we are goal-directed. We are oriented towards the peace in the coming kingdom. And we have lots of publications in our community that talk about our stand from a historical perspective. And this book, Taste for Canada, about a brother, Evans, in World War I, who suffered quite a bit for his stand in not serving during World War I. This is a picture of some young men in a work camp in World War II, and that young man right there is Charlie Dayton, who was my great uncle, passed away in 2016, almost reached 100. And this was a very interesting moment for our community because a lot of these young brethren had come from different parts of Canada. Similar things, of course, happened in the United States and in Britain and other parts of the English-speaking world. And new bonds were formed and so on. So again, it's a defining part of our community. I'll just say a few brief things about peace in the Bible. This expression, peacemaker, we probably most readily identify it with the Beatitudes. So here we see it in Matthew 5, verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. So there's a blessing associated with being a peacemaker. The Apostle Paul in Romans 12 says, repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. So that's an injunction for us. It's a way of living. So we are to be peaceful with those in our community and those without. So that I've called don't escalate. And we have two examples here under the heading of de-escalation. And a soft answer turns away wrath from Proverbs 15, verse 1. And of course, also from Matthew 5, a turn the other cheek. This, by the way, does not mean that we asked to be slapped, but it is a form of non-resistance, which can lead to de-escalation. One of the most important verses in the entire Bible that speaks to our position on peace and separation is found in John 18, verse 36. where Jesus before Pilate says, my kingdom is not of this world, else would my servants fight. My kingdom is not now from hence. And that is a guiding principle for a New Testament Christianity. And so he says essentially two things, and they're both related, that we're not part of this system of things, and we don't fight, right? Now, is this an interim ethic? Many in our community take that to be the case, but certainly it applies now. I want to just flag another issue which I think is important. Often when we discuss the Bible with people who are maybe not very familiar with it or have stereotyped views about the Bible, there is this thought that the Old Testament is highly militaristic. We have lots of descriptions of battles, and we have descriptions of the Israelites coming into the Promised Land during the conquest under Joshua and during the time of the Judges, and even later during the time of the Kings. And it's very true that there is a lot of military conflict in the Old Testament. And one of the reasons for this is something that I explained when I was presenting on the topic of race and racism to the young people on Friday night. Israel is in this very unique geographical location on the globe, which is this land bridge between Africa, Asia, and Europe. And that goes a long way to explaining why there's been so much conflict in that area, both in terms of capturing that territory, but also armies moving through that area, north or south, on their way to other conflicts. But at the same time, the Old Testament is not all about taking up arms to fight. There are elements of pacifism even in the Old Testament. Or to put another way, the Old Testament isn't as militaristic as some assume. So let me just offer some thoughts to ponder. One of the first things we can say is that the zone of war was limited to the Promised Land, right? That is very specific. There's a geographical limit to this zone of war. But we also see in the Old Testament several critiques of military power, right? So this would be odd if the Bible was uniformly pro-military. And this includes the critique of the use of iron chariots. We find this in Joshua 17 and Judges 1 and Judges 4. So some of the Canaanites who had iron chariots. This probably means, by the way, that these chariots had wheels on them with iron treads, which made them superior to other chariots. And this gave them an advantage, a military advantage, which these nations, often their city-states, could use to impose their political will on other people, right? So this is the way the arms race works today, right? The nation with the most powerful weapons often gets to call the shots, as it were. There are prohibitions in the Bible against amassing military hardware, including a prohibition against amassing horses. Now, this was contravened. It was contravened under Solomon, for example. And so the emphasis is on trusting in the Lord, of course, and not relying on the strength of horses. So that narrative exists. By the time of Jeremiah, Jeremiah is actively appealing to the Judahites not to fight, not to fight against the Babylonians, but to practice what in effect is non-resistance. And then something else to think about is we have some interesting examples in the Old Testament where very powerful military men are being depowered. So Yael, the woman who slays the Canaanite general Sisera, a left-handed man, possibly meaning he did not have a right arm. Ehud slew Eglon in a very dramatic scene in the Old Testament. A woman killed Abimelech with a millstone. Remember, he asked his armor bearer to slay him with a sword, lest it be said that a woman killed him. But it was no use. David later refers to his death and said a woman killed him. And then, of course, David himself, a boy, or at least a young, untrained man with no military equipment, just a sling and a stone, kills Goliath, this giant of a man who had all the military equipment. So there is this narrative that you find in the Bible that is directed against militarism and towards peace. Okay, just a couple other thoughts as we begin to wind down. We believe in being separated from the political systems of our day. And part of our freedom in Christ is freedom from the divisiveness of politics. We, of course, know that we have a lot of things potentially that we can divide over. So the sensible thing and the biblical thing to do is to leave politics and even informal political biases out of our community. And in so doing, we also avoid hypocrisy. And if any of our young people are called up to a military tribunal, it turns out that there are witnesses who said, oh, so-and-so was ragging on a particular politician or whatever, then we can be accused of double standards. So we need to maintain political neutrality, even while we stand for the Gospels. We can be peacemakers, as Matthew 5:9 enjoins us to do, and be all things to all people. And there is a very powerful statement in 1 Peter 2:17 to this effect. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Does anyone happen to know who the Roman emperor was when Peter wrote those words? Peter says, honor the emperor. And it was Nero, who persecuted Christians and was morally a terrible man, right? So this is a radical stance to take, this political neutrality. And it's very hard to take this stance. It's very easy when you're listening to news to say, oh, that politician is crazy, and why did they do that? And, oh, my taxes, but we have to try to maintain this political neutrality. So while the biblical world calls for religious, moral, and political, the biblical worldview calls for the religious, moral, and political separation from secular society, the biblical worldview should not be hidden under a bushel. Instead, the Bible calls for believers to be a light to the nations, bringing the hopeful message of the gospel, the things of the kingdom and the name of Jesus Christ to all people, along with this love, justice, and peace through our words and actions. And the Apostle Paul enjoins us to let the peace of Christ rule in your heart. So that's at the core of this peace that we can experience as believers in the Bible. And of course, Christ himself said, peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth, give I unto you. Let your heart not be troubled, neither let it be afraid. That's from John 14:27. Jesus, of course, in the prophecy of Isaiah in chapter 9 is described as the Prince of Peace. So the Bible tells us that in God's plan, the trajectory of history moves inexorably towards peace. Right? This is the timeline. We're not in a time of peace now, but this is the goal of history under God's sovereignty. And we see these wonderful passages in Numbers, Isaiah, and Habakkuk. But as truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. For the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea, in the third of those passages from Habakkuk. Okay, so just a quick summary. We have looked thus far at biblical theism, the belief in the oneness of God, the belief that the world is creation. Shortly in our exhortation, we are going to look at the theme of love. We have yesterday talked about justice, how God wants justice to prevail now and in the future, And we have just considered how we ought to be peacemakers and live peaceful lives, and that God will bring peace on the earth. The Apostle Paul says, "Be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life." So now go out and bring light to the world.